In the desert of North Africa in the summer of 1942, a small band of soldiers were selected by the British for a unique mission. They all had the same special skill. They spoke fluent German. These men were the children of German Jews, victims of the Holocaust. And now they would have their revenge. They called themselves the Lions of Judah.
They were hurt by the Nazis and they wanted to take revenge in fighting the Nazis. We had a motive to fight the Nazis.
The Lions of Judah were the Special Interrogation Group, or SIG. They consisted of less than 40 men and were operational for just 6 months in 1942.
Nothing could be closer than men who are all in it together, saving each other's lives, have all been through it.
Operating exclusively behind enemy lines, their mission was simple: elimination, sabotage, and demolition. Anything that would disrupt and demoralize the German army.
They did the job to cross the line and lay ambushes or patrol terrain behind enemy line.
In all of their operations, they would face overwhelming odds. During their short quest to disrupt the Nazi war effort in North Africa, almost all were killed.
My father was a brave man. He gave his life for his country.
This is the extraordinary story of the Special Interrogation Group and how they became part of British military folklore. In March 1942, a man staggered out of the desert in North Africa. He wore an Afrika Korps uniform of the German army. Bloodied and dying of thirst, he had to make it back to base. Finally, after many days, he glimpsed civilization. Before him, the outskirts of the city of Tobruk, the base for the British forces. He was quickly spotted, picked up, and taken to the British HQ, where he was treated for his wounds, given clean clothes and a stiff drink, then driven to British High Command in Cairo. Only then did he meet with his commanding officers. For the man was not a German, but Captain Herbert Buck of the Scots Guards, and he had an extraordinary tale to tell. Buck had been out fighting with the British 8th Army west of Tobruk in January 1942, when he was wounded and captured. He was shackled and taken away in a truck, but the Germans had no idea just how dangerous this soldier was.
Captain Beck succeeded to evade German captivity by killing the driver who took him into captivity and wearing his uniform and taking his arms, throwing out his body from the cabin, and he crossed the Western Desert as a German.
Buck easily passed himself off as a German soldier. Wearing an Afrika Korps uniform, he simply marched back to British territory, passing through Axis lines without difficulty. That was why, 2 weeks after escaping, Buck was back in British hands. As he related his experience to his superiors, an idea began to formulate in their minds. Buck seemed the ideal man to put in charge of a new unit called the Special Interrogation Group, or SIG. The job of the SIG was to go behind the enemy lines to create chaos. For that, they needed men fluent in German and willing to operate in hostile territory. Buck's own experience made him the perfect leader. The SIG were needed urgently because the German army were on the march in North Africa. General Erwin Rommel and his Africa Corps had landed at Tripoli, in Libya, in February 1941. Despite being outnumbered, Rommel surprised the British by attacking, driving them out of Libya in just weeks. As the British were forced to retreat to the Egyptian border, they realized it would take more than just conventional forces to beat this foe. That was why the SIG was formed. The SIG would be predominantly drawn from one particular body of men. The 51st Middle East Commando were a 600-strong unit made up mostly of German-speaking Jews who'd fled the Nazis.
Most of them had some previous account to settle with the Germans. They experienced the regime of persecution German Jewry underwent since 1933. So this was a special motivation.
In October 1941, the 51st were part of a commando force whose mission was to attack Rommel's headquarters and kill him. They failed, but most of the 51st got away unscathed. Among its ranks was a 26-year-old German Jew, Maurice Tiefenbrunner. In 1938, Maurice and his family were deported to Poland, but he escaped. Leaving his family, he eventually found his way to Antwerp, in Belgium.
I said goodbye to my parents. I didn't know that I will not come back. Nobody dreamt of a war yet, and all the difficulties which came on later. But if I would have known that, I probably wouldn't have left my parents.
With help from the Jewish underground movement in Europe, Tiefenbrunner and 950 other Jewish refugees boarded a ship in Marseille bound for Palestine in June 1939. Even in those early days, his strength of character was apparent. The SS Perita reached Palestine, but the British refused permission for it to dock. Tiefenbrunner seized control of the ship and ran it aground on Tel Aviv beach. He was interned by the British, but 2 weeks later war broke out and he was released and granted Palestinian citizenship. He enlisted in the British Army and fought with the 51st Commando, where he witnessed the horrors of desert warfare.
We were in a state of shock, many of us, because we lost personal friends. I lost my second gunner, Joseph we were so close friends, and he was killed to bits next to me, and I was the lucky one.
On the 17th of March 1942, Tiefenbrunner and the other men of the 51st were resting at a camp near the Suez Canal when a stranger appeared. It was Captain Herbert Buck. A cryptic entry by the commanding officer in the 51st diary for that day reads, "Captain Buck selects Germans."
Captain Buck was a person to be trusted, a person who could talk to, a person, also he was from a very aristocratic family who would speak like man to man, right? And highly intelligent.
Buck said he was looking for men for a different kind of challenge.
He addressed us with that idea what we could do if we would volunteer for this kind of work. He said we would be trained by experienced people to behave like German soldiers, put on German uniforms, and go into enemy territory and do intelligence as well as sabotage work there.
In the days that followed, Buck recruited almost 30 men to his new SIG, including Tiefenbrunner.
Volunteering for the commando was one step nearer to my aim to hurt the Nazis as much as possible, and perhaps being in a position to help my parents who didn't know in what conditions they are. So I and 27 others, we volunteered and said we are willing to take the risk and go.
While most of the SIG were Jews from the 51st, some were recruited from Free Czech forces and the French Foreign Legion. The only criterion for selection was that they would be able to impersonate German soldiers impeccably. With the team assembled, the training began.
Training went very well. We learned how to march in goose step. We learned how to curse each other in German. We learned how to snore in German, and all these things to look as normal as possible, to act like German soldiers.
The SIG had to master all aspects of German military machinery, weaponry, and conduct, because their disguise had to be flawless. This note was sent to headquarters in Cairo requesting equipment in the shape of one German staff car and 2 1.5-ton trucks. Any other captured German equipment was highly valued and put to immediate use.
They used German light weapons like Schmeisser, field rifle, other German machine guns, MG-34, whatever. They wore German uniforms. They had German helmets. They used German notebooks. The smallest details were German.
Then Buck took a gamble and recruited 2 German prisoners of war to help in the training.
This was his idea. And the role of the German prisoners of war was to teach the current military German language, the current orders, habits, customs in the German army.
Walter Essner and Herbert Bruckner had been captured in November 1941, serving in the 361st Regiment of the Afrika Korps. They claimed to be anti-Nazis and were recruited by Buck to teach the SIG everything they knew about the Afrika Korps. But first Buck had to ask permission to hire them. In his plans for the SIG, he described the decision as a necessary risk for training purposes, to have men who had recently been in the German army. But Tiefenbrunner had his suspicions and went to Buck to tell him.
Captain Buck said to me, Morris, everything is all right. They have been tried, they have been interviewed, and they have been interrogated, and they have been observed. They are 100% all right. They are really idealists fighting the Nazis, like you.
Buck's instinct was that the Germans could be trusted, and the training continued. The SIG were based on their own site, but within earshot of the main British camp. Every morning, the British would hear the SIG being woken with the alarming words, "Company Aufsteher," or "Company, get up." The men would be questioned suddenly on their German identities and marched to the mess room for interrogation. The tough regime knitted them into a team that became experts in handling explosives, desert navigation, and unarmed combat. They also became skilled mechanics and drivers of German vehicles. But no one in the camp had any idea what mission these men were training for. Initially, the SIG mingled in prisoner of war camps with German soldiers to gather intelligence and learn how they behaved. This was the interrogation part of their job. Only then could they be deployed on exploratory sorties behind enemy lines. But the Nazis soon got wind that there were German spies in their camps. In fact, in June 1942, British intelligence translated a secret message from Hitler to Rommel regarding the existence of numerous German political refugees fighting in Africa, and that, should they not be mercilessly wiped out in battle, should have a military sentence pronounced immediately. The Nazis would show no mercy to the men of the SIG. Capture would mean certain death. But by now, the SIG were needed more than ever, because the war in North Africa had taken a turn for the worse. In June 1942, Rommel began a massive new assault on British forces. His Africa Corps crossed the Egyptian border and drove the British 8th Army deep into Egypt. Rommel was less than 100 miles from the Suez Canal. If that fell, then the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean would be under threat. Now was the time for the SIG. And their first mission was about as deadly as it could be. The British were particularly troubled by enemy aircraft based on the North African coast. They were bombing Royal Navy ships resupplying the 8th Army. The SIG's task was to assist a new Special Forces unit, the Special Air Service, or SAS, and destroy as many aircraft as possible at two airfields, 100 miles west of Tobruk. The SAS was founded by Colonel David Stirling of the Scots Guards. Stirling had a lot to prove. A third of the SAS had been killed or captured on their very first operation in Libya. It was Stirling who requested that the SIG assist with his new mission. But were they ready for action? Though he was keen to fight the Nazis, Maurice Tiefenbrunner still had real concerns about the two Germans training the SIG.
Essner and Bruckner were very good instructors. But when we were told that very soon we go in action and Bruckner and the two German soldiers will go with us, I protested. I said it's too dangerous.
Tiefenbrunner's concerns were ignored, and he and the SIG were transported to the vast Siwa oasis in Egypt. Essner and Bruckner accompanied them. From there, 12 SIG men, including Tiefenbrunner, boarded a captured Afrika Korps truck and a British 3-ton lorry. "14 men from a Free French squadron also climbed in the back of the lorries. They were to act as captured prisoners of war. The SIG would be their German guards.
We as the guards have taken prisoner these soldiers. So whenever they're on any checkposts, so we are taking the soldiers back to some camp, right? This is our order, right?
On the 8th of June 1942, the SIG set out from Siwa, escorted by the SAS. After 4 days, their escort left, and Tiefenbrunner and the SIG changed into their German uniforms. Now, they were on their own. One lorry was driven by the German prisoner of war Bruckner and had 9 French soldiers in the back.
On the other lorry, there is some more Free French and the rest of the group, and with Captain Buck being the driver, and Essner going with.
Atop each truck was an SIG guard, posted German style as a lookout. Each man carried a German-issue Luger pistol, machine gun, bayonet, and grenades. The French were dressed in khaki with blue caps and carried a pistol each. And each lorry also concealed 2 ready-mounted machine guns. The convoy soon came across several roadblocks, manned by Germans and Italians. But their disguise was convincing, and they were waved through, even being warned about the presence of British commandos. They spent the night a few miles from the 2 airfields, their intended targets. The next day, they carried out their first reconnaissance. The Germans Essner and Bruckner were sent to a German outpost and came back with the password for entry to the airfields. The raid could now begin. At 9 p.m. on the 13th of June, Buck and the German prisoner Essner took 3 SIG and 5 French to the Martuba airfield. The French commanding officer and the other German prisoner, Bruckner, took 9 French and the remaining SIG to the airfield at Derna. Tiefenbrunner stayed behind at the rendezvous point.
I was detailed to be the liaison officer between the 2 camps and being in touch on the walkie-talkie, right, at that time, right, to the progress which they are making on the way, right. So they went out on this side, and the others went on this side, and I was in charge of the in-between.
Later that night, Buck's group returned to Tiefenbrunner with no casualties and revealed that their mission had been a total success. 27 German aircraft had been destroyed at the Martuba airfield. But what of the other party? Somewhere in the darkness, Tiefenbrunner heard a commotion.
I heard a noise and with things, with shouting and things, and the Free French officer who was with the lieutenant who was in charge of the scope came back with one other Free French soldier who said, well, what's going on? What happened? I asked him. He was completely out of breath, and he had to give him some time until he could speak to me.
The French officer told him that en route to the airfield at Dernau, German prisoner of war Bruckner had slammed his hand down on the dashboard.
Bruckner said, there's something wrong with the motor. I will try to fix it. Stop and said, wait here. And he opened up the hoop and looked at the motor and fiddled some around and said, no, I can't fix it myself. I'm going, there's a garage nearby. We just passed by. I will ask their help.
Bruckner never returned. Minutes later, the truck was surrounded by Germans, who ordered all French out. No one moved. Instead, the SIG's machine guns opened up. In the fierce firefight, many Germans died, but not before they'd killed the 3 SIG men and 7 Free French soldiers. Though shocked at their losses, Buck, Tiefenbrunner, and the remaining men gathered their equipment and headed back to base. It was clear that Bruckner had betrayed the SIG. Captain Buck was devastated and was now more concerned about the other German, Essner.
Very ashamed of myself. He was very ashamed. I said, look here, I will take it upon myself. We're going now back. We try to get back to our camp, but I will sitting next to Essner. For me now he was a German, an enemy, right? And nothing else mattered. And I said, when you move, you're a dead man.
Tiefenbrunner guarded Essner for the week-long journey back to base.
When we came to our camp, I said, this man has to be taken to British headquarters, but he's very dangerous. If he moves, makes a wrong move, shoot him. Don't take any risk with him. He will try to shoot you or escape.
So was Essner a double agent too? We will never know. But he did try to escape and was shot dead. In subsequent weeks, the full story behind the airfield raids became clear. 2 Luftwaffe pilots captured in July 1942 revealed that the Germans knew the SIG were coming weeks before the raid. It was also rumored that Bruckner was flown to Berlin and awarded a Golden Iron Cross, and that this double agent's real name was in fact Brockman. And though the raid on the airfields was partly successful, it didn't slow Rommel's Afrika Korps. Rommel, who by now had been promoted to Field Marshal, made an attempt to break through to the Egyptian capital, Cairo. If Cairo fell, it would only be a matter of time before the German army reached the Suez Canal and controlled all shipping in and out of the Mediterranean. A British defeat looked to be on the cards. But Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery had other ideas. Montgomery had been tipped off by British intelligence and was ready for Rommel. In the Battle of Alam al-Halfa, Monty deliberately left a gap in the front line, enticing Rommel to attack. He then ordered his tanks to remain in their positions instead of charging the enemy. The ground was now laid for the fiercest of battles, and Monty held the line. Meanwhile, British High Command in Cairo once again summoned Captain Herbert Buck of the SIG, where he was given orders for the SIG's next mission. It was even more dangerous than their first. In early September 1942, Tiefenbrunner and the other commandos were sent to a new base deep in the Sahara called Kufra. The Kufra base was home to another special force, the Long Range Desert Group, or LRDG. The LRDG was made up almost entirely of men from New Zealand and Rhodesia. Many of its members would go on to serve in the SAS. The LRDG were experts in desert navigation and specialized in reconnaissance and intelligence. During their stay at Kufra, the SIG rested or went swimming in either the salt lake or the freshwater pool constructed by the LRDG. But finding the SIG drilling in German uniforms and using German commands astonished even them. Then on the 5th of September, Lieutenant Colonel John Hazelden, the man who would command the SIG on their next mission, and 83 men of the SAS drove into the Kufra base.
My father was pretty athletic. He was a good shot. He rowed, he sailed. He had a thoroughly good time, if you ask me.
Hazelden was born in Egypt and was fluent in both Arabic and Italian. His love for the land of his birth was his motivation for keeping the Nazis out. He arrived in Kufra to collect the men of the SIG for a perilous mission. It was called Operation Agreement, a raid on Tobruk.
He was the man who had the idea first, but his original plan was only to go on the raid with a handful of men, say 20, no more. But it wasn't to be. I think what happened was that the planners got hold of the idea that what a super thing it would be to smash up Tobruk totally. And it blossomed into some enormous raid.
Tobruk was the most important seaport in Libya. It was the chief supply route for Rommel's army. It had been captured by the Afrika Korps on the 21st of June 1942. By September, Tobruk and the surrounding coastline had become heavily fortified. Rommel had 50,000 men and over 400 tanks in and around the port, and there were anti-aircraft and shipping defences spread along the shoreline. The British knew that if they could destroy Tobruk, they would strangle Rommel's army. Operation Agreement was to be a three-pronged attack. The Royal Air Force would begin the operation with a surprise bombing raid. The combined SAS and SIG team, codenamed Force B, were to destroy the coastal guns east of Tobruk. With the guns knocked out, 396 commandos waiting offshore on board HMS Zulu, HMS Sikh, and HMS Coventry would attempt a landing west of the port. They were codenamed Force C. And then an amphibious assault by motor torpedo boat, codenamed Force A, would land and attempt an assault on the port itself. As in the raids on the Libyan airfields in June, the SIG would play the same trick they trained for. The SIG were to be disguised as Germans, but this time would be escorting British prisoners of war, the SAS. The SIG would be dressed in German uniforms, speaking German, and carrying German weapons, paybooks, insignia, cigarettes, chocolates, and even love letters from fictitious wives in Germany. Joining Captain Buck and the SIG for this mission was a new officer from the SAS. Lieutenant David Russell had approached Buck and volunteered his services.
Buck had spotted or been told about David Russell, who was fluent in 6 dialects, spoke German like a German, and would have contacted him.
Russell had no illusions about what he was getting into.
It is what you would say is high, very high risk. I think they all had the intention of coming out alive if they could, but they knew how dangerous it was.
On the 5th of September, Force B, including Captain Buck, David Russell, and 6 men of the SIG, left Kufra for the 800-mile journey to Tobruk. They travelled in German trucks that had been painted with stolen Africa Corps stencils. After leaving their base, Force B were soon finding the going hard. In searing heat, they had to negotiate great seas of sand and almost sheer cliffs to reach their objective. Trucks had to be dug out of the sand on several occasions. With their spirits raised, Force B and the SIG, now just 90 miles from Tobruk, set off for their objective. At first, the convoy did not attract attention from the German and Italian patrols. Miles from Tobruk, one of the trucks was deliberately disabled and parked for use as a getaway vehicle. The 3 remaining trucks each had 30 SAS acting as prisoners of war and were driven, of course, by the German-speaking SIG. But as day turned to night, they faced their first test. Out of the darkness, the lead truck was challenged loudly in German. It stopped, and a German guard began asking more questions than anyone was expecting. Fearing they'd been rumbled, David Russell did what he had to do.
David jumps off, goes into the darkness, then comes back with a gun, chucks it back into the lorry and says he won't need this anymore. And he does write to his sister saying, when you feel as I do about family, it is very difficult to steel yourself and to have to go and kill people in cold blood. But in this game, it's kill or be killed. And if you're on the run and you're being hunted, your blood's up and you just have to go and try and save your life and anybody with you.
It was now 10:30 p.m. Above the convoy, the RAF were about to signal the start of the mission. Under cover of the bombing raid, Hazelden, Buck, Russell and Force B reached a small house overlooking Tobruk. They burst in and drove out or killed the Italian platoon inside. From here, they and their fellow commandos could stage raids on their intended targets, the coastal gun emplacements. The SIG and SAS teams worked separately through the night and knocked out as many of the guns as they could. At 2 a.m., they were satisfied that enough guns had been destroyed and signaled that landings could commence. So far, Operation Agreement was going to plan. But as the sun rose above the horizon on the 15th of September, the enemy, now fully alerted, regrouped and closed in on Force B. Realizing they were under attack, the Germans sent in masses of reinforcements. Cut off and outnumbered behind enemy lines, Force B, the SAS and the SIG were now sitting ducks. But they continued with their mission. They moved inland and took control of 4 anti-aircraft positions. But they were soon in deep trouble.
They were beginning to be overrun by both Italians and Germans, and after all, they were a very small force, split in two, and my father's headquarters were being besieged.
Though they'd achieved their objective, Force B were now isolated and alone in hostile territory. They knew they were in trouble and managed to get a message to headquarters. They received a reply that shook them. It acknowledged that Force B had done its job, but HMS Seek had been disabled. HMS Zulu had retreated after being hit while towing HMS Seek. HMS Coventry had been hit and was on fire, and that Force A had failed to land and were withdrawing. Operation Agreement had failed. Commander of Force B, Lieutenant Colonel Haselden, knew that time was running out. He now ordered everyone to destroy their belongings. And then he gave the order to retreat. The SIG retrieved the getaway truck.
David Russell brought the truck up to the headquarters that Hazelden had taken on, and they put the wounded into that. But by this time, some Germans had arrived and were shooting at them. So Hazelden, who was following in the wireless operator's truck, then came rushing back, and David Russell and a whole lot of men were sort of covering fire, giving covering fire for the wounded truck, etc. And I think it was then every man for himself.
Haselden jumped into the truck with the remnants of Force B and drove off. But after just a few hundred yards, he braked hard and jumped out. he decided to stall the enemy by standing and fighting.
My father decided that he needed to try and drive the enemy back, and he single-handedly charged the German position, and apparently, so I read, they were forced back and the trucks managed to get through.
3 men of the SIG joined Haselden and they fought a pitched battle with the advancing forces. But they were soon overwhelmed, and Haselden was in trouble.
Unfortunately, he was killed, and while he was on the ground, a hand grenade exploded on top of him, and one of the SIG men, Hillman, I think, was bending over him when this bomb actually exploded. But it didn't kill him, but his face was totally blackened.
But thanks to Haselden, the SIG had enough time to escape.
My father was a brave man. He gave his life for his country. I don't suppose for a minute he thought that he was going to be killed. I don't think you'll go into battle thinking I'm going to be killed, because if you do, you can't really achieve anything. It may be there, but you have to push it to the back of your mind and get on with what you're doing. Otherwise, you've defeated before you start.
From the original Force B party of 90 men, 6 of the SIG survived. Together they marched across the desert in search of Allied forces. After many close calls with the enemy and suffering from malnutrition and dehydration, Captain Buck, David Russell, and the SIG reached Allied lines 2 months later, on the 18th of November, 1942. The assault on Tobruk had been an unmitigated disaster. From a fighting force of about 1,000, the Allies lost 746 men, along with HMS Coventry, HMS Sikh, HMS Zulu, and several other amphibious boats. German and Italian casualties amounted to just 16.
I think there's agreement throughout everything I've read that it was a disaster. It should never, it shouldn't have been allowed, quite honestly.
The failure at Tobruk marked the end of the SIG, and surviving members were transferred to other units. Many would distinguish themselves in battles to come.
David Russell was asked to take over the Guards Patrol of the Long Range Desert Group, and I think everybody felt, he'd really done quite a good job, having been a wild card to begin with.
Lieutenant David Russell later joined British intelligence, but was murdered in Romania in 1943. In letters to his family, there was no doubt of his fondness for his comrades in the SIG.
You admire the qualities in the people, you really get to know each other, and you act as one, and I'm sure that David and the SIG and the SAS men did that too.
Captain Herbert Buck was killed in a plane crash while serving with the SAS in 1946. Maurice Tiefenbrunner also joined the SAS and became David Stirling's interpreter. He survived the war and is the only original member of the SIG living today.
The SIG did the job they were asked to do, and a bit more than that. I think that we fulfilled a duty which could not done by a whole normal regular army, because we were bringing the prize onto and carried out action which was in complete surprise of our enemy.
Tobruk was name is written deep in our Middle East campaigns. Tobruk, which we held as a fortress behind the enemy lines for 9 months and which had already changed hands twice, was ours once more. The date was November the 13th.
The British forces in the Second World War spawned many daring, special or unconventional units. The SIG were the least known, but those that passed through its ranks were unique in their background, their training, but above all, their courage. Edwin Hardy Ames, British style icon, celebrated fashion designer, friend of the Queen, a famous name on Savile Row. But as a young man, he was also one of Britain's most unlikely spy masters, with a secret wartime past. Hardy Ames would always deny it, but now we can reveal for the first time the truth about how he masterminded a ruthless campaign of assassinations. He worked for SOE, the Special Operations Executive, Winston Churchill's secret army. Ames sent agents into occupied Belgium and played a deadly game against a brutal enemy. He worked with the resistance to eliminate whatever stood in the way of liberty, including some of the Germans' most feared agents.
Et quand il nous avait donné le nom de gens qui travaillaient pour les Allemands et qui étaient dangereux, c'était à nous de les descendre. Hein.
You need only one shot, one well-placed shot.
Now we can open the official files and show for the first time the role played by this most unlikely soldier and just how far he was prepared to go. Hardy Ames was born in 1909 in Maida Vale, London. The son of a civil servant, his mother was a saleswoman for a clothing firm. Before the war, he worked in various fashion houses and ran a textile factory in Germany in the 1930s.
Und nun ein Wahnsinniger oder ein bewusster Lügner kann denken, Sieg heil!
There, he saw Nazism on the rise. But politics didn't interest the flamboyant fashionista. Ames was having the time of his life. His career was taking off. By 1934, he was design director at fashion firm La Chasse. And he mingled with Hollywood stars like Ginger Rogers. The one thing that risked undoing everything was his personal life. Hardy Ames was gay, something that was illegal at the time. But the war changed everything for everyone. As Britain stood alone in 1940, Hardy Ames was called up for officer training. This most unmilitary man found himself in uniform, albeit a tailored one. Soon, he was serving as a captain in the intelligence corps. Ames spoke fluent French and impeccable German, and his business skills meant he was an efficient organizer. This skill set quickly came to the attention of a shadowy organization that used the seemingly banal title of MO1-SP. But this was cover. The organization was the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. Its mission was to break all the rules of warfare. Churchill gave it the order to set Europe ablaze. Using guerrilla tactics, sabotage, and propaganda. SOE also set up resistance networks throughout occupied Europe. It employed numerous spies, saboteurs, and trained killers. Its recruits were taught to kill with their bare hands, to parachute into enemy territory, operate radios, and place explosives.
It didn't recruit in a conventional way. It chose linguists, it chose patriots. It chose people who, in the conventional jargon of today, thought outside the box. And an awful lot of people were confining their thoughts very much inside the box in the early part of the war.
Ames was just such a free thinker, and so SOE came calling. His personnel file shows what an exemplary, if particular, recruit he was. This officer has done very well on the course. He is far tougher both physically and mentally than his rather precious appearance would suggest. Then, in November 1941, he went into action. He was sent to London to work in T section of SOE. T section was in charge of Belgium. Its job was to strike at the enemy in the occupied country. Ames quickly found himself planning and executing missions into Belgium. He also supervised training and recruiting of T-section agents. But Amy's flamboyant side and charm always showed through. This document lists a series of Shakespearean code names to which Ames has added, "What a wonderful cast. May I do the costumes?" Despite the levity, Ames was involved in a deadly game. He planned in detail the parachuting in of waves of Belgian agents and the clandestine landing of radio operators. Between July 1941 and October 1942, 45 agents, many selected by Ames, went into Belgium. Their mission was to make contact with men like Marcel Frankson, a young Belgian determined to strike back at Germany.
On s'est dit qu'il fallait faire quelque chose contre l'occupant. Il fallait d'une part prouver à l'occupant qu'on ne considérait pas sa victoire comme définitive, et il fallait d'un autre côté supporter le moral de la population belge.
For Marcel Frankson, Taking on a ruthless, well-armed opponent was an enormous task. It was hard to know how to hit back at such an enemy, so he welcomed the help of SOE.
À partir du moment où vous avez des contacts avec le SOE par l'intermédiaire de ses agents, vous savez dans quel sens vous devez faire vos sabotages plutôt que dans un autre. C'est positif, hein?
But Hardy Amies was soon running into trouble. T-Section was finding it hard to make contact with men like Marcel Frankson. And it was dealt a number of severe blows throughout 1941 and 1942. Despite sending over 40 agents into Belgium, the section was failing. Because in Belgium, Amies faced a formidable enemy. The Germans were firmly in control. Their well-organized counter-espionage system was waiting for his agents. It excelled at catching SOE's spies and breaking up their resistance networks.
There were two main German services who were active against the networks. There was first the Abwehr, who was fighting the Allied intelligence, but there was also the Geheime Feldpolizei, who was active directly against the networks to protect the army against the spies, but also against saboteurs.
These German units were especially skilled at targeting SOE's Achilles heel, the radio, whose signals were easily intercepted and tracked. Special detection units from the secret police were listening out for SOE radio operators.
Every time you use it, you can be detected by the Funkabwehr, so the section of the Abwehr specialized in the detection of the clandestine radios. So the first radio operators were very soon arrested by the Funkabwehr.
The Germans locked up many of these agents and radio operators here, at the notorious Saint-Gilles prison in central Brussels. The code names of the agents they caught are a roll call for the early failures of T-Section and Hardy Amies. Agent Intersection, caught March 1942. Terrier, caught April 1942. Balaclava, caught May 1942. Sometimes the Germans did something even more sinister. They turned some of these captured agents. Then they used their radio sets to contact London and sow disinformation. One in particular would become notorious in T-Section, Armand Campion. He was used by the Germans from early 1942. He duped T-Section for months. Requests were radioed to London for more weapons, money, and agents to be sent by parachute, only to be dispatched straight into a trap. What's more, Belgium was crawling with fascist sympathizers. Volunteers ready to hunt down resistors or spies. And often, they had an added incentive: money.
C'est des gens qui faisaient ça pour de l'argent. Quand ils dénonçaient un réfractaire, ils touchaient 500 francs. quand il dénonçait un résistant, il pouvait toucher 1000, 2000 ou 5000 francs selon l'importance de la dénonciation. Et s'il dénonçait un maquis, alors là, ça pouvait monter à des dizaines de milliers. S'il parvenait à faire prendre un maquis, ça montait à des dizaines de milliers de francs.
These paid informers caused havoc. And one Nazi sympathizer and active agent on the German payroll became infamous. Prosper de Zitter. De Zitter was the Abwehr's #1 Belgian agent. He had served in the Canadian Air Force in 1918, been charged with rape and embezzlement, and even done time in Belgium. He was a nasty piece of work. After the invasion of Belgium, he worked for the Germans, masquerading as an Allied soldier or airman. He infiltrated resistance networks and escape lines that were set up to smuggle downed aircrew and agents out of Belgium, and he was good at his job.
This man had an extraordinary capacity to inspire trust and to present himself like an authentic resistor. Some people say that because of the action of Prosper de Zitter and his collaborators, about 1,000 resistors were arrested.
Marcel Frankson's small group of resistors would encounter de Zitter to their cost.
Prosper de Zitter, nous avons eu affaire à lui 2 fois à Bruxelles.
De Zitter infiltrated an escape line that Marcel's group often used.
Cette ligne est entrée en rapport avec un certain capitaine Jackson, et c'était de Zitter. Et cette ligne a été, et ce groupe a été arrêté, et notre agent a été arrêté aussi.
Then, again in June 1943, Marcel Frankson's friends in the resistance came across de Zitter. This house in Rue Jean van Volchem in Ixelles housed another resistance cell from Frankson's group. Led by Marcel Demonceau, it was busy planning an assassination attempt on Leon de Grelle, the Belgian fascist leader. But the Germans were tipped off by de Zitter.
Ils se sont défendus, ça fait un véritable fort Chabrol dans le quartier. L'équipe qui était dans la maison lance 2 grenades et tue un certain nombre d'Allemands.
The resulting battle went on for hours. Eventually, the Germans captured the safe house and most of the occupants. Everyone would be executed, including Marcel Demonceau, whom they captured a month later.
Cette fois-là, de Zitter est responsable de la mort de 6 ou 7 personnes, enfin.
Back in London, Amies and his colleagues were in despair. The Germans were winning. 32 SOE agents had been captured. Worse still, over and over, de Zitter had hindered Amy's plans. First, an elaborate propaganda mission. An SOE agent set up a news service with London using carrier pigeons to send out copies of Belgian newspapers. De Sitter busted the network. Then, he hindered a boy's own SOE plan for 2 agents who were pilots to steal an Me-110 night fighter from a Nazi airfield. Now it was getting personal. Ames wanted De Sitter's head. SOE was desperate for a solution to the situation that could turn the tide. So they decided to do something about it. They planned to stage a wave of assassinations across mainland Europe, including in Belgium. In June 1943, a top-level SOE planning committee meeting took place. The men present plotted the operation and set a start date, October the 1st. Minutes from the meeting state, execution campaign. The council considered a paper recommending a concerted campaign against SS and Gestapo officials. The proposal was accepted, but should for the most part be confined to civilian officials rather than soldiers. News of the assassination operation soon began to filter through to all departments of SOE. This was Hardy Amy's chance to get De Sitter. His target would be the collaborators and sympathizers who helped the Nazis to rule. The operation was renamed Rat Week. It was ready to be put into action. A call went out to all country sections to identify targets for assassination. All Ames had to do first was get it approved by the Belgian government in exile, led by Hubert Pielot. Pielot's government was made up of politicians who had fled their homeland in the chaos of 1940. It was bedeviled by infighting. Everyone had their own agenda. When it came to intelligence, the Belgians had 2 agencies based in London: the Sûreté, the civilian intelligence service, and its military rival, the 2e Section. All this made for confusion. Nothing could be done in Belgium without the say-so of these different groups. So Ames turned on the charm and threw himself into the mission. Letters flew back and forth between his department and the Belgian government via its representative, Idès Flor. And Ames began to show just how far he had come from flamboyant fashion designer to ruthless spy master. August 1943, copy to Idès Flor. It is proposed to hold a so-called Rat Week in all the occupied countries, when a certain number of quislings are to disappear. Could you please create a list of possible candidates? Yours, Major H. Ames. When the Belgians stalled, an increasingly impatient Ames began to press for a response. Am I to understand that your authorities do not want our boys to participate? The matter is really getting very urgent. All across Europe, all other governments had granted their approval for the assassinations. Ames was under pressure. It was about to get worse. In August, Ames was promoted. He became acting head of T-section. With the new post, the personal burden on Ames to get the Belgians to play ball mounted yet further. Rat Week in Belgium depended on him. At the same time, A familiar name cropped up in SOE correspondence in a letter from MI5. It ratcheted up the tension still more. The letter showed that MI5 also needed Amy's to take out De Zitter. Would you please refer to my letter of the 19th of August 1943, referring to the notorious Belgian Prosper De Zitter? I would be very interested if you would let me know how the matter now stands. In particular with regard to De Zitter and whether or not your proposed Rat Week has taken place. Then, a bombshell from the Belgian government in exile. Amy's received a letter from his Belgian contact, refusing to allow the Rat Week hits on collaborators or quislings, including De Zitter. My authority do not, for the time being, think it advisable to take special measures against Belgians collaborating with the enemy. This would involve too many difficulties. The difficulties they feared were reprisals. The Germans were notorious for murdering civilians across Europe in any area where sabotage or espionage occurred. Their reaction was even more aggressive if one of their own, a soldier or an agent, was killed. The Belgian government in exile feared such a bloodbath and wouldn't budge. They stuck to a belief in judicial process. Lists of traitors are being made up with a view to meting out to them their just sentence after the war. By late October, the official deadline had passed and Amy's seemed defeated. I am sorry, the Belgian authorities will not allow us to carry out Rat Week as originally intended. It looked as if De Zitter and others like him were safe. There, the story of Rat Week appeared to end. On the surface, it seemed it had been a failure. But it appears that hardy Amy's would not let the Belgians stop him. He turned to his top agent, André J. Wendelin. Wendelin was a T-section star who had volunteered to return to Belgium. He was in Belgium on a mission with another agent, P. Liederkirk. Their mission was to establish links with Belgian resistance groups. Amy's planned to send Wendelin a top-secret weapon from SOE's inventory, one that had been specifically designed for assassination and that had been earmarked for Rat Week. It was called the Well Rod. It had been designed specifically to kill enemies of the state or anyone who was a nuisance to SOE. The pistol was affectionately known as the bicycle pump, or assassin's pistol. Critically, if it fell into enemy hands, it couldn't be traced.
The well rod is what's described as a sterile weapon. There were no numbers, there were no makers' names on it. There was nothing to indicate who had made it or be able to make it traceable.
The Royal Belgian Military Museum was bequeathed one of these rare weapons 20 years ago by former members of the Belgian resistance.
Yes, certainly.
The keeper of firearms, Paul Dubrenfo, shows just what a useful killing machine it really was.
The way to load a well-rod pistol is the same as for a normal so-called automatic pistol, put from 1 to 7 cartridges in the magazine, and then put the magazine in 2 places. As you can see, the magazine is also the handle of the pistol. To load the pistol, or to make it ready to fire, just push the bolt forwards, and you just turn the back of the bolt to close it completely. And handle the pistol, being sure that the safety behind the handle is well pushed forward. And just pull the trigger like that.
The design of the well rod made it the perfect weapon for a discreet execution because it was silent.
The main purpose, of course, is to kill in silence. Inside the tube, you have rather important quantities of washers like that. Between the washers, you have a rubber washer. And the bullet, while passing through the holes, is, of course, leaving the barrel quicker than the sound, which is kept inside the tube. And that's the purpose of this silencer, is to delay the sounds coming out of the tube.
The choice of caliber for the well rod was also a deliberate design decision.
The 765 Browning has a muzzle speed of about 900 feet per second, and we can say that in a device like the well rod pistol, it could be subsonic. That's very important for a silenced pistol like that to be used to kill people without making too much noise. The only thing you will hear is the firing pin and the bullet stopping into somebody or something.
November 1943, Ames was ready to send in the well rods. The mission was called Tybalt 2. His plan was backed up by the head of operations for SOE. It is far better to send the 5 well rods and let them do what they can. A handwritten message on the back of the note makes no illusions as to what Tybalt's mission was. Tybalt, the pistols are intended for the elimination of your enemies. Let us know as soon as you have any results. Even though well rods did make it into Belgium, no one can be certain that these or later batches were used to kill collaborators. Most police records were destroyed in the last months of the war. But what is clear is that a lot of killing did occur in 1943 and 1944, and Marcel Frankson was involved. His small group of saboteurs ended up working as an action squad with the Front de l'Indépendance, a group of communist-inspired partisans.
Il faisait des sabotages, il faisait des exécutions de collaborateurs. C'était de très bons saboteurs et des gens très actifs.
Marcel's job was specific. It was to kill anyone working against the group.
Et quand il nous avait donné le nom de gens qui travaillaient pour les Allemands et qui étaient dangereux, c'était à nous de les descendre. Hein.
Amy's was eager to impress his superiors. He explained that groups like the Front de l'Indépendance had been extremely busy. A Rat-Week memo of the time talks of a collaborator being arrested, interrogated, and shot through the nape of the neck. Then, as Rat-Week continued, even better news filtered out of Belgium. More violence and retribution had been meted out. Nazi sympathizers, pro-Nazi activists, and Rexist politicians were killed. It lists the murders. Amy's was able to show more results and placed it under the heading Rat-Week. It was a success for the dressmaker spy, and even when it was officially over, the killing continued. As 1943 turned to 1944, Marcel Frankson's group continued to execute any collaborators they could find.
La patrouille de garde arrête un type qui a des allures louches. Il avait à son dos une curieuse bague. On regarde de près. Il avait oublié d'enlever sa bague des Waffen-SS. C'est un type qui avait été en Russie. Inutile de vous dire que quelques heures plus tard, il était mort. Hein? Nous n'avons jamais tué de collaborateurs qui ne faisaient que de la propagande allemande. Nous n'avons jamais tué que ceux qui travaillaient directement pour la police ennemie. Et nous en avons tué 33.
Even now, decades later, Marcel Frankson feels no remorse.
Quand on sait comment la police allemande traitait les résistants, comment ils étaient torturés, la façon dont ils s'y prenaient, eh bien, on n'a pas de pitié pour ceux qui dénoncent des compatriotes comme ça et qui les livrent à l'ennemi. On n'avait absolument aucun état d'âme à le supprimer. Hein. Au contraire.
But one person who had so far managed to elude the killings was the number one target, De Zitter. However, a new SOE agent, Francois Matteau, had him in his sights. Matteau was sent to Belgium in early 1944. He was to make contact with Marcel Frankson's group and coordinate their activities. He took with him 2 weapons.
They had to choose which weapon they will bring with them. They're free to choose. And my father chose a little 380 automatic Colt because it's small and concealable, and a well rod. It was to be used to kill people because it's not a weapon for warrior, it's a weapon to eliminate something.
And so, one night, Matteau decided to make his move on De Zitter.
Because De Zitter was known as being very often at a dancing place in the center of Brussels. So it was decided to act.
They staked out the location for hours. But De Zitter never showed. It seemed De Zitter had got away with his crimes once again. Despite this, Amy's and his men managed to transform the overall picture in Belgium throughout 1943 and 1944. They had turned the page on their early failures. 1943, Brussels newspaper vans delivered the daily editions of Le Soir. But the resistance had been at work and replaced the Nazi-sponsored edition with a resistance-printed version bearing articles ridiculing the Nazis. It was a magnificent propaganda success. Sabotage operations and armed attacks were also on the increase, and Marcel Frankson was in the thick of it.
On a fait 15 attaques surprises ou embuscades contre les colonnes allemandes. Vous mettez 2 ou 3 obus reliés par du cordeau détonnant bien cachés sur le bord d'une route. Vous êtes avec votre détonateur électrique à 100 mètres de là, et au moment où un convoi passe, vous mettez le contact et vous faites sauter les obus et vous abîmez 3-4 camions de troupes, enfin. Hein. Dès que vous avez fait ça, ben vous ouvrez le feu à la mitrailleuse dessus.
Resistors blow up supplies of oil and fuel, locomotives and barges. They also blow up factories and cut communication lines. Group G, another prominent resistance organization, was especially active. Its great achievement? It sabotaged the entire Belgian high-tension electricity network. The resistance, with SOE's guidance, was managing to harass the Germans on a daily basis and turn the tables. And soon, Amy's would be at the heart of one of the most successful stories of SOE wartime activity, and a masterful T-section operation. Operation Overlord was the planned Allied invasion of mainland Europe. By the summer of 1944, it was clear to everyone, even the Germans, that it was coming. So the Allied Supreme Command needed the resistance in mainland Europe to ramp up its sabotage and harassment operations behind enemy lines. In the days before D-Day, they swung into action. The US Army Air Force joined the RAF in dropping more and more weapons to SOE agents as sabotage operations escalated still further. Amy's T-section was deeply involved. Hundreds of canisters of arms were dropped into Belgium. And soon, his involvement would go far deeper. On June the 6th, 1944, the Allies finally attacked the beaches of Normandy. It was the greatest amphibious operation ever undertaken. In the weeks after D-Day, the Allies pushed further into France. But eventually, the advance slowed. Supplies couldn't keep up with demand. What the Allies badly needed was deep water ports.
At the close of the war, the Germans instituted a program of demolitions. Their aim, as they withdrew towards the Reich, was to destroy anything that might be of use to the Allies.
This included ports and railways. In France, for example, after the Normandy landings, the retreating Germans had rendered virtually all port equipment unusable. The Allies were now vulnerable. Everything hinged on the capture of the last major port left, Antwerp.
Antwerp was critical. It was the key port. Now, if we captured Antwerp intact, if the cranes and the infrastructure was in one piece, it allowed us to reinforce the troops from Northwest Europe.
So Amies and his agents were given the mission of protecting Antwerp. T-section was at the heart of an SOE plan called Counterscorch. Counterscorch involved using resistance groups under SOE control to prevent the destruction of this vital strategic target. Amies sent in 2 wireless operators. They helped resistance teams, notably from Group G, to defend the port. The 2 agents kept the men at the port informed and supplied with regular drops of weapons and ammunition, as well as detailed instructions. As Allied ground troops approached in early September 1944, any German attempt to destroy the cranes or docks was robustly seen off. Antwerp's port was held. It was a massive success.
Amazingly, Antwerp was taken almost intact. The whole port system of canals and docks fell undestroyed into Allied hands.
The saving of Antwerp port enabled supplies to continue to flow to the advancing Allied armies. Belgium was liberated in nearly a week. Now came the chance for retribution. In concert with Amies, resistance forces came out of hiding to police the handover when the Allies arrived. And the word went out to catch the wanted man, Prosper de Zitter. Amies' former foe was tracked down, imprisoned, and then executed in Brussels. 4 years later. It was a triumph for Amies and the Belgian resistance. Eisenhower praised their work in an open letter. They can be justly proud of having, by their devoted heroism, contributed so largely to the liberation of their beloved homeland. Hardy Amies was now sent to Brussels. He was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, and for 6 months headed an SOE mission designed to wind down the resistance networks he had helped create. It was a personal moment of glory for the dressmaker from Maida Vale. But all memory of his role in Rat Week and the wider successes and failures of T-section seemed to be conveniently forgotten. In fact, Hardy Amies rarely acknowledged his part in SOE or the details of its Belgian missions. If approached about Rat Week, he simply told people, "Sorry, old boy, I don't know anything about it." Hardy Amies was knighted in 1989, and it was only after his death that some of the truth about this dressmaker spy's surprising past began to emerge.